Hello and welcome to another Wolfram Institute live stream. Today we are joined with Christopher Gilbert, um, who I tutored at Wolfram Summer Research Program when he was a high school student 2 years ago.
Think
Um,
so.
yeah, Christopher has a book out he wrote during high school. It's a
A
quantum
little before that, actually.
quantum mechanic. Middle school. Quantum Mechanics for Kids, if I got the title right. So it's
Yep.
like a little children's book explaining quantum theory. At the research program, he did a project on universal quantum gates, and that led to him receiving a Davidson Fellowship the next year. Um, he'll be starting at MIT soon this coming semester studying computer engineering. Today he will be talking about self-replication in cellular automata. Christopher, take it away.
All right. So, yeah, exactly. Hello and welcome. As Dugan said, I work this summer on these like persistent and self-replicating structures, and I'm going to be just presenting some of the work I did over the summer today. And if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll get to them when I see them, or I'll also have some time for questions at the end, I think. So just going over the super basics of all this and a little bit of nomenclature. A cellular automata is basically just a grid of cells which can be in a number of different states, and the states are updated according to a certain set of rules. So for the types of automata I'll talk about in this talk, it'll look something like, if your neighbors immediately above you look like such and such, set your state to this. So you can see like this thing highlighted in red matches the grid of cells down there. And in this way, any initial condition given at the top will propagate downwards kind of through time according to these rules and eventually generate some sort of, structure or pattern or something along the grid. And a persistent structure is something which just doesn't, die out. So the thing on the left eventually just turns to all zeros, while the thing on the right doesn't. So if it dies out and becomes all zeros, it's not persistent, but if it survives, then it is persistent. And just a few kind of different classes of these persistent structures you might see are like fixed points, which just don't change at all, or periodic structures, which repeat eventually, gliders, which repeat but with a shift, or these different types of growers that are either kind of structured in some way or self-similar or, sort of more complicated than that. The really broad categories you should get out of this are the like repeating ones on the left and the growing ones on the right. And of course, by like the pigeonhole principle, any structure must be either repeating or it must grow. Okay, so now that we have that just like basics down, I'm going to go more into the project itself. So part of the reason that these types of structures are kind of so interesting to study is their parallels to like life and biology, and especially the origin of life. You can think of like self-similar structures being able to replicate. They make exact copies of themselves, which is sort of like a toy example of reproduction. So if there are any trends in how and why self-similar structures emerge, then it might be able to tell us something about how other reproducing systems, like life, first emerged. Um, this project also has some more kind of direct applications to mathematics. Cellular automata are just these like discrete transformations on a list of symbols. But this can mean that they correspond to like, first order difference equations. So like a fixed point in a cellular automata is sort of like an equilibrium, or a periodic structure is like a cycle, or infinitely growing structures are sort of like, a divergent sequence. And you can study, similar sorts of things, like whether a fixed point is an attractor or not. So whether, nearby states will lead to the same final state. Um, and so that's, some interesting connections that I studied here. But actually, most of my time working on this project was just in programming and developing new tools to like efficiently do this research. So I spent months working on like a GPU accelerated brute force solver. I came up with classifying algorithms and a few other tools just to make it kind of practical to quickly test a hypothesis. And so that's actually what we'll be talking about first is a couple of these tools, starting with this periodic structure classifier. So given an initial condition, you can, run the rule and generate its structure, and you might get something like this. So what my algorithm does is it looks at just the binary representation of each of these rows and checks it for periodicity. You see it's just bouncing between these two values, so it's a period 2 structure. And it returns the period as well as the canonicalized form, which is defined to be like the minimum of these numbers kind of once it's stabilized. So here it would be just 151. And generally this works on other types of automata because some have more than just two colors, but you can use different base representations to get a number. And so that's what the canonical form is. And it can also check for like growing structures and that kind of stuff. But most of the complexity of this algorithm really comes from like the edge cases. For example, you can have two structures that are kind of placed next to each other. And that's also, a valid initial condition. But if you just did the like kind of normal checking for period here, you'd get a period of 6. But in actuality, it's kind of better to think of it as the one on the left has a period of 2 and the one on the right has a period of 3. And so you can try to split those structures, maybe like with a vertical line. But if you have two gliders right next to each other, you can't use a vertical line. So it makes it, a little bit hard. And I tried a bunch of approaches, including like causal graphs, seeing, which cells lead to certain changes in other cells. But it didn't turn out to be quite the right approach. And my final solution was to just split the initial row and check that all following rows are exactly equivalent to the logical OR of the two separated structures. And if that's true, then you can say that the structures are, separated there. So altogether, just the thing that the algorithm can do is when you give it an input of something like this, which is, this huge structure that takes 500 steps and stabilizes into 5 periodic structures and 1 glider, and the algorithm is able to just return the canonical form of each, which we can see those are actually all the same type of structure, as well as the canonical form of the glider and its shift. So it's able to just chug through that and figure it out. And it includes actually some more output, which has information with like what rule led to that structure, the initial condition that stabilized into it, and an approximation of how many steps it took to stabilize. But that's kind of less useful information. And the way you use it is very simple. So this is just sort of the usage. You just call detect period with a rule and an initial condition. And an initial condition can either be a list of cells or an integer in the base of the number of colors that the rule has. And you can also just deduplicate the result. Like here, we got the same structure multiple times, but you can deduplicate it by just saying dedupe same. And so if you wanted to, for example, do like a large scale search of what are all the structures that this rule generates, you could do something like this, where it just iterates over all initial conditions, catenates all of them together, and deduplicates. So talking about performance quickly, it's fairly well optimized, and it uses the Wolfram compiler pretty extensively, especially for its like subroutines. Pretty much all of that is just compiled code. So depending on the rule, it takes anywhere from about 200 to 1500 microseconds to determine the behavior of a single initial condition. And this can, of course, be parallelized. And this also, of course, depends a lot on the type of initial condition. If it's a very small, very low period initial condition, it'll get it right away. But if it's, this big glider gun growing structure, then it might take a lot longer. But that's the average. This algorithm is not completely perfect. There do exist some initial conditions that take too long to stabilize, and this won't be able to find the behavior of that. In fact, no algorithm is actually capable of doing this exact problem, solving this, because it's actually just equivalent to the halting problem in some cases. There exist, cellular automata rules that are Turing complete, like Rule 110 and a bunch of others now. So finding out whether an initial condition dies or not, in the worst case, may be just equivalent to finding out whether a Turing machine halts or not. So therefore, the problem itself is undecidable. But my algorithm works on the vast majority of inputs, and a randomly generated rule is super unlikely to have that behavior. Okay, so for the next rule, or for the next tool, I developed this brute force GPU accelerated solver written in OpenCL. So if you want to find, all of the structures that a rule generates up to some really large number, it's, a problem that's highly parallelizable. You can just do each separate initial condition completely separately. And so it's a really good fit for a GPU. And it's also good for a couple other reasons, like you can kind of bit pack a single row of a cellular automata into integers and just do binary arithmetic on them. So you can get really, really good performance just doing this on a GPU, which is great. But it is also still has those complications with the edge cases. And that's on the right is the diagram for kind of the control flow of the GPU algorithm, which is, pretty convoluted because, it has to deal with all these weird sorts of edge cases. Except it's now much more difficult to than before, kind of because of the nature of low-level programming. Like in the previous tool, the detect period tool, I could keep a whole, history, and I could have, widths that are kind of arbitrarily wide. But with a GPU, you have fixed width integers. So once it gets beyond a certain width, you have to figure out what to do with it, either by, splitting, shifting, or returning early. And even something as simple as like dynamic allocation isn't possible on most GPUs. So you can't even keep a history of what the automata has done so far, which makes it a bit harder. Um, so the way that it's implemented on the GPU, I'm going to go a bit more into that, is that each the simplest possible one is a two-color cellular automata, where you can just match each bit of an integer to a cell in a certain row. But with more colors, you might have to match multiple bits to a single color. So for example, a four-color cellular automata, a single row might be represented something like this, where, a black cell is represented by two zeros, or a red cell is represented by a 0, 1. And in this way, you can represent kind of any arbitrary cellular automata. So it works very generally, but you have to use multiple bits per cell. And then in the actual implementation of this update rule, kind of what we want to have happen is we have the current row that the cellular automata is on, and we want to find out what will the next row be. And if you look at, something like a cellular automata rule, like that row plot in the top right, it kind of gives you this lookup table. If you're in this situation, do this. If you're in this situation, do this. But this is in the like really hot path of the program. Like this is getting run hundreds of times per initial condition. So like maybe billions, trillions of times. You really want this to be as fast as possible. And iterating through a lookup table is a really slow way to do that. So what's much better is to like find a Boolean circuit, which actually just implements that directly. You can just give it, in this case, it would be 5 inputs, and it's able to give you the output that would make. And there do exist algorithms for this like Boolean generation, like the CNF and DNF, and so like conjunctive normal form, disjunctive normal form, algebraic normal form. There are all these forms that you can create Boolean circuits from, but they're very restricted. They have low gate depth, and so they're not often very. They use a lot of gates is the problem, and that means that you have to do a lot of computation, which is quite slow. There are also algorithms that can find the optimal circuit, but they're super slow to compute. Anything beyond 5 variables is pretty much intractable. For a little taste of how slow they are, it involves generating every single possible Boolean circuit up to a given number of gates, which you don't want to do that. So what I did was I developed a new algorithm that can find a reasonably good solution in a reasonably short time. And I'll explain this algorithm to you right now. So consider you have this like lookup table kind of thing where you have all of these function inputs. We'll call them X, Y, and Z, your Boolean variables, and you get, this list of outputs. And the like overall strategy for this is just divide and conquer. If we can, split it up into an upper half and a lower half, call them, A and B. If you can find um, if you can find representations for the top half and the lower half, then you can put them together. The obvious way to put them together is just by looking at the last variable and saying, if z is 0, then use A, but if z is 1, use B. But this involves like 3 gates, an AND gate, and 2 OR gates, and a NOT gate, so 4 gates actually. But you can do this a bit more efficiently by actually XORing the top and the bottom half together. And that way you can just say, use the top and XOR it with the last variable and the bottom. And so that just gets rid of some of those gates. So it's a more efficient way to do this. And now you can apply this divide and conquer algorithm and just look at the top half. So let's look at just A, split that, and do the same XORing trick. And now you can immediately identify that these two, say the top half, A1, is just represented by like not X. So we can see, an f of 0, 0, 0, f of 1, 0, 0, that X variable is 0, 1. But what we see here is 1, 0. And so we call that not X. But in the bottom half, we see X. And so that's just, kind of the base case. And then you can build it back up from there by going backwards and saying, you have this not X from back here, XORed with the next variable and X. And you do that same thing for the bottom. You XOR the two together. You identify what types of variable it uses. You bring it back together, and you get this final output. And you can actually also just call simplify on this output, and it tends to do a fairly good job. So here we have kind of a comparison for a bunch of different algorithms you might use for this sort of thing. You can see the like conjunctive normal form and disjunctive normal form and algebraic normal form all produce answers with, 11, 13, 10 gates. If you simplify them, you always get this same 10-gate solution though. But my algorithm produces a 14-gate one, but if you simplify it, it gets down to only 9 gates, which is, better than all the others, even in this, very small scenario. And simplify works better on mine because XOR has a lot of these really nice identities, especially when like nesting and with a bunch of NOT gates. Like you can do a lot with nested XOR gates, which makes simplify work fairly well. For a larger comparison of these different algorithms, here's algebraic normal form, which tended to work best. Probably also because it's high prevalence of XOR gates, especially when simplifying. So for this one 5-variable Boolean function, the algebraic normal form uses 177 gates and takes 52 microseconds to compute. So for both of these numbers, we want the number of gates to be like smaller is better, because that means it'll be faster to run on the GPU. And then that time figure is the amount of time it took to generate that answer. So the simplified one took a little bit more time, but gave you fewer gates. And my algorithms, the difference between algorithm 1 and algorithm 2 is how they order the different variables. Like one does each variable one at a time, and the other tries to optimize for which variable should go first, but also does less simplifications because it takes a little bit longer. And what we see is that the simplified even algebraic normal form gets around 100 gates, while my solutions get 22 or 36 gates. And in fact, it's known that the optimal solution only takes 22 gates. So I found something that's completely optimal, and I found it in 78 microseconds, while my code to find the optimal one took 30 minutes to run. And for much larger functions, we see that same sort of effect. A simplified ANF has 650 gates and takes 360 milliseconds to compute. but one of my algorithms gets 420 gates in half that time. And my other algorithm gets an even better number of gates, but it takes a decent amount of time to compute. And of course, the optimal solution here is completely intractable generally. Um, so I get very good results with this algorithm. And that actually allows me to get, very good speeds on the GPU, as well as through, a whole bunch of other optimizations that I spent a lot of time working on. So I get around 1 to 100 million initial conditions per second is how fast I can search. That, of course, depends on the rule complexity and how many of the initial conditions survive. Like, if a rule has almost every single initial condition immediately go to 0, it'll be a lot faster. Um, and in fact, with one specific rule, code 20, I optimized it up to almost, 750 million initial conditions per second. And I ran that on a multi-GPU cluster for a few hours, and I was able to run it through the first 100 trillion initial conditions. And I found the following results. Unfortunately, these were all known due to some other methods that can find periodic structures. But yeah,
Wait, so is
okay.
that a range, the speeds of 1 to 100 million initial
Yeah,
conditions per second? It can be anywhere in between those, so it just really depends a lot on the rule.
exactly. And it
Okay,
can even be a little worse or a little better than this. A rule which immediately just goes to 0 every single time can get, way better speeds because it just
right.
immediately dies in every situation.
Okay.
But this is the kind of thing I tended to see across various rules. So yeah, this is just it's a huge range, I know, but that's kind of what I saw. And now the actual implementation in Wolfram language is a little convoluted. It's so the Wolfram language supports integration with OpenCL through like OpenCL link, but this only seems to work on discrete GPUs, and I just have a laptop with not that. Um, but actually, you can call OpenCL through C anyway, and it just uses your CPU instead. So what I had to do here was um, basically when you call the GPU structure search function, it generates all those rule specific constants like the radius and colors, as well as that like Boolean expression for how to implement the update rule. Um, and then it fills those in as like templates, so it like pastes it into an OpenCL file, and then it calls a C program, which runs the OpenCL code and writes the results to a file, and then reads back out that output file. Um, so even with all the complexity kind of behind the hood, the usage is pretty simple. You just give it a rule, a lower bound, and an upper bound, and it gives you all the unique structures that it encountered within that range. So this makes it possible to do, pretty gargantuan searches across a very large number of rules. Okay, on to some other tools, and I'll just go through these really quick because they didn't end up being as kind of pivotal to my research. But they were, some other tools I developed partly during my time this summer. First was a like cell by cell solver, which is able to search for periodic structures much more efficiently by kind of iteratively increasing the initial condition width and then applying constraints. So it starts out with just one cell, then it moves on to two cells, then it increases its width. But because it does that kind of one by one, you can apply a bunch of these constraints saying like, oh, the top needs to be the same as the bottom if you want it to be a periodic structure. And, through that, you can get it to do, you can get a very big win. And that win is that the algorithmic complexity is exponential with regards to period, rather than with regards to width, like a brute force search would be. So, like a brute force search can find small structures with large period very easily, but this approach lets you find large structures with small period. And in fact, using this, I was able to find a novel structure in code 20, so that hasn't been found before. And it's this big number, which is something like 3 sextillion. That isn't even within 5 orders of magnitude of what I was able to do with the GPU search. And it's period 6. Um, so that's pretty cool. Next, I worked on trying to find persistent structures by like kind of continuous optimization, So normal cellular automata rules have like, this kind of lookup table, but you can interpolate between all those different rules and get just a continuous function. And you can just run algorithmic optimization techniques to optimize, 100 cells down the line, make something survive, make the largest possible max value you can here. And it sort of works, especially for like fixed points. But with anything larger than that, it got stuck on, larger periods. I think it just tended to hit a lot of, local minima. And finally, I developed like a backtracker, which allows you to find the like predecessors of a condition. So given a final condition, it'll give you all the different initial conditions that may have led to it. So that's often useful in like trying to find like minimal forms of a certain structure and looking at, what initial conditions eventually stabilize to one particular structure.
That's interesting. That's usually not unique unless it's a reversible CA.
It is not. So it tends to either blow up or just disappear, is what I've usually found. But with a lot of the structures, it blows up, and you get these, huge lists of, 3 steps back, there are, 10,000 different things that you could have done to get there. So what I usually do is I just sort them by what's the smallest, like simplest thing I could have done to get there. So usually the kind of thing you'll get is, this small initial condition sort of expands out and eventually settles into this larger structure, which is, an interesting thing to look at because it kind of like increases the complexity, like the entropy of the initial condition. Yeah. So now that I've laid some of the groundwork for the like algorithms that I've used, I'm going to go on to some of my like actual results. And I'll start with like basic kind of statistical trends, partly just to help understand how like these types of structures typically behave. And then there's also some more data that, answers more concretely my research questions.
We have a question from the live stream.
Oh, go right ahead.
Brady asks, the idea of relabeling bit pairs with 4 colors is an interesting translation to base 4. Can this be extended? Seems like layers of abstraction of any 1D history.
Exactly. So generally what you're just doing here is you have, these multi kind of colored cellular automata where the rules accept many different colors and spit out many different colors. And you just represent the colors as different binary integers. And so if you have only 2 colors, it's super easy to represent in binary because you can just assign 1 bit to each. But if you want more colors than that, yeah, like this is kind of a base 4 kind of thing because there are 4 colors, you have these 4 different digits, and so you assign each to 2 bits. And you can do this, generally for any number of colors, in fact. And it takes, the ceiling of the the log base 2 of however many colors you need. So like if you needed, say, 7 colors, that would take 3 bits. Or if you need like 200 colors, that would take 8 bits per single cell. So it does work for generally, any number of discrete colors, which corresponds to like any kind of base. And something like 3 colors is a little bit inefficient, you'll notice, because you don't use one of the values. Like you never use the 1, 1 value when you're working in 3 colors. But although it's a little inefficient, it's still a lot faster than representing it as like a list of integers generally. But yeah, good question. Okay. So the first result is just the persistence of an initial condition. Like how often do initial conditions persist? And what I found is that there's no like single number for, in code 20, initial conditions persist 10% of the time. It actually varies a lot depending on kind of the starting size. So here we see that if the starting size is very small, say around like 100, the chance of it persisting is fairly low. But as it gets larger and larger into the, like if your initial condition is of size 10 to the 30, there's a much higher chance. And this size number represents the like binary value, not the number of cells. So yeah. But as it increases,
you mean the binary number being a certain size.
yeah, exactly. So like kind of near each power of 2, I pick 10,000 initial conditions, and I just test to see, how many of them are persistent. And that proportion is the height at each point in the graph. Yeah. And the upward trend is, I think, due largely to, so the upward trend is the interesting thing. Why does that happen? And, my theory is that it's because these extremely large initial conditions can be broken down into approximately like causally distinct subsections. So, you have these huge initial conditions, and those are likely to produce, an automata or a persistent structures versus the smaller condition up above, which, doesn't produce something. You can kind of think about it like every, width 100 initial condition is basically equivalent to 50 width initial conditions kind of smushed together. So if structures are fairly rare, then the chance of the width 100 initial condition persisting is about twice the chance that that each individual width 50 subcondition will persist. And this works mostly because they're pretty causally separated. Like something at the far left and the far right won't be causally linked until well after all the structures have settled out. And in fact, this is corroborated in other rules. So code 1329 is much more productive. You see this is at like 10 or 15% persistence chance, while this is up near 80%. And it even begins tapering off towards 100% towards the right. But even so, the same pattern emerges, and it just increases up and up. And we can actually do this for a huge number of rules, using kind of the tools I've developed to just check for persistence. And so here's a plot of every single totalistic quiescent 2-color 3-radius rule. And it's just that same sort of plot about how often does its initial conditions persist at various sizes. And although each slope is different, and this depends on like how productive the rule is. Does it generate a lot of structures or very few structures? But although all the slopes are different, every single one has the same ultimate behavior, which is it increases as time as the width increases.
Sorry, is this 2 radius or 3 radius?
Oh
I
yes,
think you
it's
meant
supposed
2
to be 3
radius.
radius. I think the slide is wrong.
Okay, 3
My bad.
radius.
Yes. An interesting trend here, though, is that in these sort of things, and therefore that doesn't grow with size, which would explain the plateau. The next thing I looked at was how often are unique structures found. So in these graphs, a lot of the structures appear again and again and again. You've seen the same structures over and over. But as you do these large searches, you do eventually find newer structures that are different and not just summations of previous ones. So this is kind of the rate at which new structures are found. So the height is how many structures have been found so far, and the x-axis is just what number did you search up to. And this is search up to 10 to the 10 for code 20. So as you get kind of larger and larger, it seems that the rate of discovery tends to decrease. Even if you look at like the 100 trillion run I did on GPUs, you could extend this graph further, and it shows the same sort of trend where these are very, very rare, and they get rarer as you go on. So even though the number of initial conditions is growing exponentially, this grows sub-logarithmically, the number of structures up to a certain number. But that sub-logarithmic trend actually isn't only is not actually shared across a great number of different rules. So this is code 1329. Oh, by the way, glider guns are colored red, while repeating ones are colored blue. But instead of becoming rarer and rarer for new structures to appear, it looks approximately linear. So as you increase the size by a certain amount, you'll see a roughly proportional increase to the number of structures that have been found so far, which is kind of interesting that it shows a different effect. So you have sublogarithmic here and logarithmic growth here. And there are even some rules which show superlogarithmic growth. So this is code 1842, and we see a different trend. As you increase the number of values, it increases the rate at which structures are found. So not only do rules kind of widely vary in the absolute number of unique structures, but even in this kind of asymptotic behavior. So the next thing I'm going to look at is the periodicity. And this is just a stacked bar chart of a bunch of different rules and what periods occurred most often. So you look at all the structures that a rule produces, and you give their periods here. And a periodicity of 0 represents a growing structure, so like aperiodic. And this is for a sample of well-behaved 2-color 4-radius rules. And they're all run up to across their first million initial conditions. So what we see here is that the most common one is just single periodic, like a fixed point, while the other kind of periods start to taper off. Though we do see a bunch of outliers. And you also see this across, more rule sets. You'll see one that's at like 50, a periodicity of like 50 randomly, even though it's very much clustered around like 1 or 2 or 3. And another interesting thing to note is that it varies kind of a lot by the type of rule. So each color here represents a different rule. And you can see some that are like the purple rule is very much a grower. It pretty much only produces growing structures. Well, this orange rule seems to make a lot of fixed points and also a lot of period 3 ones, but not a lot of period 2. So, those sorts of trends emerge. Certain rules tend to have the same periods, including across a very wide variety of different structures of that rule. Okay, so now we can get on to some of the kind of more practical results. And, one of my goals was to study the relation between these structures and the origins of life. So we can describe each rule as, it sort of represents kind of a toy model of chemistry where kind of different sorts of reactions occur. So within each rule, we can describe a structure that grows or makes copies of itself as an organism. And, something that's like a fixed point structure is sort of like an inanimate object in this sort of analogy. What we'd like to do is find rules which admit both organisms as well as inanimate objects. We want something where it's possible for things to grow, but it's also possible for things to stay still. Since, in our real world, that's what sort of happens. I mean, some organisms reproduce, well, they're like, rocks that just sit there. And you want to have both in a chemistry that represents life. So one good starting place is the identity rule, and that just returns an exact copy of what's ever immediately above it. So this is equivalent to like an inert chemistry. Nothing like there's no possible reactions and nothing ever happens. But as we introduce more mutations, we get kind of this spectrum of rules. So at one end, it behaves very similar to the identity rule. Very little ever happens. There are very few reactions that take place. But as we mutate the identity rule more and more, we get more and more types of reactions and generally more complicated and more growing structures. And that's what we see here. So the blue line is the number of static structures, which, of course, at the identity rule, everything's a static structure. So there are no growing structures. And the orange line is the number of growing structures. The anti-identity rule, which is just every single one is flipped, only contains growing structures. So we sort of see those two trends. And since we defined kind of a lifelike rule to be one that admits both animate, like growing objects, as well as inanimate, like static structures, then we can plot the frequency of both happening. And we can see that it's kind of only in the middle where lifelike rules are most common, and specifically a little bit skewed to the left. Like the lifelike rules are most common where there's a fairly low number of reactions. And therefore, a possible conclusion to draw from this is that life is kind of most likely to emerge from chemistries that mostly admit stable compounds, but also have kind of a sufficient number and diversity of reactions to support kind of a growing organism. So this may or may not be entirely accurate yet, because almost all of the growing structures kind of don't exhibit behavior that I would classify as being sort of like life. Like you see a lot of this sort of stuff, where it's just a single cell growing itself quite a lot. Which, could represent life in certain analogies of the cellular automata. But what we really want to see is like kind of growth with complicated individuals. Like you see the same thing duplicating itself over and over. Or even something like self-similar growth, where each individual is given, a chance to replicate. But what's really interesting is that if we search only for this kind of definition of lifelike, then we see the exact same trend emerge. This is across 2-color, 3-radius rules. And lifelike structures, ones that are, self-similar in either this sort of way or this sort of way, again, only occur at these small but kind of non-zero number of mutations. Which, is really interesting that result from before over here, this green line, shows the same shape as this. And it's possible to go up to 127 mutations here. So really there's this big hump towards the low numbers of mutations.
So on the x-axis here, the left-hand side is the identity rule still, but the
Correct.
right-hand side, what would those rules look like?
Yeah, so if we look at the rule plot, it would be exactly everything opposite. So, like here it's 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 goes to 1, but the anti-identity rule is 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 goes to 0. So every single one of these bits are flipped, except for the last bit, because all of my tools work on that it has to be a quiescent rule, like a complete row of zeros must turn into a 0. So, like when I
mutated this rule one at a time until you flipped every 64 bits.
Yeah, so I pick n indices to flip. So, I might pick, you flip the first bit and the 8th bit and the 12th bit. And as n increases, that's what the x-axis is. There are more and more places where bit flips occur. So yeah, here it goes from 0 to 31. Because there are, 31 outputs in this rule. Yeah,
So do you have an intuition for why the anti-identity rules, so to speak, don't produce growing or self-similar structures as much?
Yeah, I think it's because actually the anti-identity rule is really not terrible to analyze. It's really simple because it just starts with, say you're just starting with like a single bit. In the next row, it'll be the flipped version of that bit, but also to every side, it'll be a 1. So you start with a 1, below it will be a 0, and next to that you will have all 1s. And so it kind of just builds a pyramid that flips every single bit. So it's a very regular structure, and it will always grow. Like it's provable to show that, whatever initial condition you give it, as long as it's not 0, it's gonna grow.
But it wouldn't make pyramids. It would just take the initial condition to just nod it each time.
It would make pyramids actually, because if you look at
because of the quiescent thing.
Exactly. Yeah, so if you look at if you're 2 to the right of that first bit, then that's going to turn into a 1 because you match the condition 1, 0, 0, 0, 0. And normally that would be a 0, but in the anti-identity rule, it would be the opposite of that, which is a 1. So yeah, I probably should have included an image of that there. I might be able to pull up one after. But it's not too bad to analyze, yeah, the behavior of the anti-identity rule. And so it's sort of a, you could think of it as like kind of a simple result that, obviously the identity rule only admits static structures and the anti-identity rule only admits growing structures. And since, it's probably just a linear thing, you can do that. And therefore the ratio of both is, just a hump in the middle. Which is part of why I also looked at this other definition of like lifelike growth. Because I wanted to see that same result corroborated without kind of this underlying explanation behind, oh, this might be why. But it's also useful to have, an underlying intuition or explanation for why that sorts of trends emerge. Yeah. And the final thing I looked at was like the stability of these structures in code 20 and in a couple other rules. And in particular, I was talking about how these are kind of related to like difference equations. And so this is sort of like the concept of attractors. If you make very small changes to the input, is there small changes to the output, or does it result in wildly different structures? So kind of what you're trying to do is I did it on an 18 width initial condition. So really what you'd want to do is look at like an 18-dimensional Boolean space, but this has its difficulties. So the thing I chose was to like make a Hilbert curve and assign each index along that curve to be the gray code of the initial condition. So the upshot is that similar initial conditions are in similar locations. And what we get is this. So every different color represents a different asymptotic behavior, like a different structure that comes out. So, the purple might be one structure, the red is another, etc. So what you should observe is that, if a lot of similar colors are very close together, then that indicates that a structure is robust to small changes. But if colors are highly separated, then there's a high sensitivity. For code 20, we can spot a few clusters, but these are rare and small. And in general, what you should observe is that, yeah, there is a very high sensitivity to initial conditions. If you change, a single bit, you're very likely to completely upend whatever structure will come out of it. And this also tracks across a bunch of different rules. This is code 1329. There's this really common structure which is labeled in red. And again, you see some actually fairly big patches here. So if you change, a few single bits within that patch, it won't change the output. But it still shares the same kind of static looking image in the rest of the plot. So that indicates that this is also not very robust to small changes. And this is a bit of a problem because it indicates that, like in real life, organisms are robust to small changes. They have to deal with a very wide variety of environments. But it seems that these structures aren't very well able to deal with that. You could say that they don't have like a concept of like homeostasis almost. Like there's no negative feedback loop that, keeps them coming to the same output no matter what your kind of input condition is. It might be a good analogy to compare it to like, life is often compared to like fire because fire grows. But fire at its core is a positive feedback cycle rather than like a negative one, like, most biological life. So instead of kind of reproducing, it just burns itself out. So this is sort of a fair criticism of a couple of the experiments here, but the fact that some trends showed up across growing structures, which don't have as much of this problem, like here we see the self-similar structures are the same as the growing structures. They act, similarly. I think that alleviates a lot of that concern. So yeah, most of my conclusions were sort of gone over during the analysis, but I think that the most important finding, or the one at least most immediately applicable to areas like biology and the origin of life, is that self-similar and lifelike structures tend to appear only in a certain sweet spot with regards to the rule's distance from the identity rule. So this may tell us something about how many reactions are needed for a chemistry to support life or complex organisms. And so I think that's definitely an interesting finding and potentially worth some further research. Next, some of the tools and algorithms I developed, I think will certainly be helpful if I or others decide to pursue this topic further. They're pretty well tested and solid, and the GPU structure search algorithm, the period detection algorithm, and all the other algorithms that I developed to interrogate this problem might help other people do research on this topic and even on some similar topics it's helpful for. But also that efficient circuit generation algorithm might actually have uses kind of far beyond cellular automata, because that's a solution to a very general problem, and actually a very common problem. Like you see it come up all the time in like FPGA programming, and so it might be very useful in coming up with maybe FPGA circuits or heuristic based circuit minimization, which there are some programs for, but they're only heuristic based. So the more you can add on to them, kind of the better and better they get. So that might have kind of very wide reaching applications. But yeah, altogether, I'm super happy with the progress I made this summer, especially with the kind of amount of and freedom of programming and exploration I was able to do. I want to give a big thank you to my mentor, Willem Nielsen, who helped so much with, finding my research direction and helping me develop new ideas. As well as, everyone at the Wolfram Institute here who I got the chance to talk to, or from whom I got some helpful technical expertise. All right. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Yeah, so thank you. Exciting. Really cool that you were able to get the GPU to just like go through these really fast and can you talk about the type of structures that are repeating? Like how wide are they usually? Or what is the width that you're, so you have like this initial condition, then you have like this history layout, and then you're trying to find repeated elements.
Oh, here, yeah. Like in this sort of thing, looking for like, or in the looking for structures like this
Like,
sort of thing.
yeah, right there. Okay, so um these are like different initial conditions.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh-huh. And
And
so do you start with like a condition and then look for it repeated, the same condition repeated in the structure?
yeah,
Or
so what I do is I run it for some numbers. Say, so given an initial condition, what I do most of the time is run it for 100 steps, and that usually gets it to kind of stabilize itself. And then I take a copy of that initial condition and run it again. And if I ever encounter that copy that I'm keeping, then I'll know, oh, it's repeated after this many steps. And therefore it's a periodic structure. There are cases where it doesn't repeat, like maybe it hasn't stabilized yet. Even with 100 steps, it hasn't finished. And so if I run, another 100 steps and I still haven't found something, then I'm like, okay, surely this isn't right. So I reset my copy to be this new state and run it for twice as many steps this time. And this helps you catch, stuff with really large periods. And it also helps you just run through a very large number of steps to check how long it takes to stabilize. And then for the glider guns, what I actually do is I don't have kind of a normal rule. I have one that's kind of like pushed up against a sidewall. So the initial condition is aligned all the way to the right. It's like right justified. And then when the rule applies itself, it applies it kind of sideways and downwards. So it's like every vertical structure becomes kind of a diagonal structure. But then once that happens, I can just shift it right, and you're never at any kind of chance of losing data off to the right. So it allows you to just treat periodic structures and gliders completely the same. So you don't get any, there's no difference between the two as far as my program can see. Or maybe the only thing my program ever sees is gliders, is perhaps a way to say that. But yeah, that's sort of
sometimes the gliders stay put, and they're just sort of an oscillator.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a glider with shift 0. So that's how that sort of works. And
so if you have an initial condition that doesn't repeat the initial condition but repeats some other elements, does your algorithm search for those types of outputs?
yeah, so if it's something that eventually, say it starts, actually, there's probably a good example here. Yeah, this guy. So this guy starts by doing a bunch of stuff. It'll never repeat its initial condition, but it will.
And you have like, whoops.
Oh, I see. Sorry, it showed up on a different part of my screen, but that was looking at something different. So I was like, what are you doing? Yeah, so you have these subsections that repeat. So what I do is that at every point, so say like, if I'm here, is it possible for me to split up this at any point and have it be the same? So like, I'll start at the left and keep moving up until I hit this point. And I say, okay, consider everything to the left of this and everything to the right of this. Attempt to run these separately. So run the left as if the right didn't exist, and run the right as if the left didn't exist. You can just step those downwards. And if they ever interfere, like if they ever overlap, it's like, this is obviously wrong. If I split it, in the middle of one of these structures, something's obviously wrong, because it'll collapse. But if you, get it right in the right spot between the two structures, then it'll work out perfectly. They won't ever touch. And so that's what you do. You split it here, and then you recurse, quote unquote, but there's no recursion. It's actually just a fixed stack. But you recurse with this guy, and with this guy, and with this guy, and with this guy. You split here, where you recurse with this guy, you're able to split here, and you recurse with this guy. And in that way, it's able to, do each of these separately. And, it's just able to.
So if you section that off and then run a separate test with that as an initial condition, then it would repeat that initial condition.
Yeah. And actually, I think this isn't caught by my GPU solver, because the width here is I believe it's 256 bits. I use 4 paired integers together, 4 paired 16 integers. But because this is a 3-color rule, that means you only got 128 cells, and this is wider than 128 cells. But by the time you get to here, if I had a slightly wider cell count, then it is actually able to split, right here and say, hey, these will never interact. Or even here, these will never interact. And so in a lot of cases where, you would think you need to wait until down here until everything's settled, you can prove it, well above with, pretty small widths. So yeah, that's how it splits them.
I was wondering, you mentioned applications to other like nearby problems. Do you think it's possible, for example, to convert using something similar to your approach, a Turing machine, into like Boolean form that a GPU could work on? Or
maybe. That's interesting. Let's see. I guess if you could represent its state as some sort of like, yeah, integer, and then you can match its integer kind of in a bitwise way. Maybe. Yeah, it's good for that sort of thing where if you could get a Turing machine and represent it as like a Boolean lookup table, like you have these bits that are representing the Turing machine, look at all of them, and in this case do this, in this case do this, in this case do this, then it's able to say, okay, now instead of a lookup table, how do I get this to just go directly? Like instead of having to search for it, you can just compute it, without any looking up. You can just compute it directly. And so it could make that sort of thing much, much faster if you kind of already had the Boolean representation there. Yeah, which is this is actually like a fairly well, like it's a problem that comes up a lot in like an FPGA. Like say you wanted to like have an adder, like an 8-bit adder. You have all of these different possible inputs, and you want to say, hey, what sort of output should I get upon different conditions? And maybe if the only thing your FPGA could do is like a NAND gate or something, it's like how do I represent all of these adders as just the most simple possible NAND gate? I think the most common thing is like AND inverter graphs, where you have AND gates and NOT gates. I think that's the most often used in FPGA programming. But something with an XOR gate can be decomposed into that. So it might be useful in that sort of area. And there are a lot of like heuristic kind of minimizers for that. There's like one called espresso, and there's like a ABC minimizer, where it's just like given this sort of AND inverter graph, try to make it smaller. And you can use this sort of technique to help with that in a few cases, perhaps. I'll have to test that. That's one of the things that I might work further on in this research.
That's decomposing the rules into Boolean gates.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should know this, but remind me, and maybe for others, what does FPGA stand for again?
Field Programmable Gate Array, which is a awful description of what it does. What it does is just like kind of give you a hardware where you can give it a circuit, and it just makes that circuit it makes those electrical connections inside. So like a CPU is able to be programmed like with a programming language, but the actual circuitry behind it never changes. All the circuits stay put. But with an FPGA, you're able to write code which modifies the circuit directly. So you're actually just modifying all these little wires or presumably gate arrays inside of it in order to do something. So like CPUs are so like you can do very complicated stuff in an FPGA, but it's much harder to program because you're programming often individual gates or very, very low level stuff.
Right.
Yeah, so it's like a ASIC, an application specific integrated circuit that you can reconfigure by software.
Exactly.
You can tell it to reconfigure its gates, and it'll sort of be like so it's really fast, and it has a very, very low response time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what rule spaces did you investigate primarily? I mean, I saw radius 2 binary rules.
Yeah. It was mostly I looked at about an equal number of totalistic rule spaces and just regular rule spaces. And within that, I looked at 2-color radius 2, 3, and 4, and 3-color radius 2 and 3, or 1, 2, and 3, and 4-color radius 1 and 2, I believe. I actually looked at, I have these huge notebooks of finding like every single structure in like 2,000 different rules that I had already like checked for that there exist, at least a couple interesting structures in. So I have these whole, notebooks of, oh, this looks really cool. Oh, this looks really cool. Oh, this looks really cool. But, there's not a lot of research you can do with cool looking stuff. Maybe it'd make for good ties or something. But I looked at a lot of rules throughout the course of this. just looking at, what structures do these rules produce. But yeah, I focused a lot on code 20 and 1329 because those are of some research interest kind of beyond this. So this, 1329 here, where was it? Yeah, those are like the general examples I used. Yeah, this is code 20.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the images you saw here are generated by one of those two.
Do you happen to have pretty examples?
I might. Let's see. Uh, Let me get a Wolfram notebook open real quick.
Okay.
Just 1 second. Sure, let's take a look at this. Uh, okay, so yeah, here are k equals 2, r equals 2. These are interesting, those are interesting, etc.
Okay. Okay. Slow down. Slow down. Oh, awesome.
Yeah, it's that 3-color. This one's also 3-color, but it's very Sierpinski-esque.
And it's rendered in grayscale, or is it converted back to binary?
It is just grayscale, but if you look very closely, there are some that are black, some that are gray, and some that are white. But this is run for 3,000 steps, so it's hard to distinguish that. I think these are all 3-color rules as well.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. These are some interesting kind of paired structures.
Uh-huh.
You get a couple of these, which are like, oh, couldn't you have just split those two? But they actually have an effect, like they change a couple bits within the other structure, which they happen to still be like here. You can see that they actually touch here.
Uh-huh. Oh, that's interesting.
They still keep their, kind of original nature. Like they still look like.
Now, yeah, I mean, these are different structures for the same rule set?
Yeah, these are two different structures in the same rule.
Okay. So like the one on the left, is that represented that looks like it's there on the right. Oh, I see. Wait a minute. Is that
Almost the same as the thing on the right, except that there's like one bit that's missing on this guy.
uh-huh.
Even though it's kind of like there are just two structures kind of appended to each other, it actually results in slightly different behavior. And so
Right, right. So I
you don't,
guess
return everything that you can. Like I don't want to miss interesting stuff. So for, weird things.
so you're saying like these guys here are different than it's not exhibited here, for instance.
Yeah.
Huh.
So
And
you see, it's fairly rare
this,
to see that though.
mhm.
Only in a few rules. What else? I have a bunch more notebooks actually with this kind of stuff.
Cool. Let's see it.
Pay no attention to the names of these notebooks.
The names have changed to protect the innocent, right?
Of course, of course. Oh no. Yeah, this one's pretty funky.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you see that they do collide, but it turns out to be fine. It's this guy. You have all these different variations of this grower,
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
as well as this periodic structure, which is crazy periodic structure. This one, which, yeah, this also went above the width limit. So you can see like here, this didn't, stabilize fast enough to be able to detect.
Mhm.
You got this third structure, another one of those things. You have this, which I think there's a huge plot of at the bottom. Oh goodness. Yeah,
Oh,
very, which
so
does
this is
not,
this is a grower, and it has some sort of like chaotic edge to it, and then it's
yeah,
leaving off some oscillators.
yeah. And it's not even like a glider gun. Like a glider gun would, leave these oscillators at specified intervals. Like the pattern of glider guns would eventually become periodic, but not within the first, what, 10, 20,000 steps does that happen.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, this chaotic thing must, itself be growing or must eventually do something else with enough time. And here's like a zoomed in view of what that looks like at the very end. So
Wow. That's really really interesting that the chaos is confined to a little region
I know, right?
that itself doesn't seem to be growing in width. I don't know.
Yeah. What else? I'm sure I have more.
Actually, before you go on with that one, hi, I'm Brian, and Dugan, we were sort of saying that there's a fancy thing going on that's spitting out other things. This looks like a baby one-dimensional version of what Brian's brain does.
Interesting.
Would
Actually, look at some.
actually, Christopher, do you know that rule?
I don't. I've heard of it, but I don't recall it offhand.
Okay, I invented the rule, but I didn't name it. Somebody else named it after me. If you just Google for Brian's brain, there's a Wikipedia page about it. Yeah.
I thought you were talking about your actual brain. Just kind of
No, no,
does
no.
something
It's just
chaotic
not.
and then leaves something good every once in a
Yeah,
while.
yeah. No,
Okay, I understand it.
what this is this is a rule that there's all of these crazy glider guns.
Yep.
And you could see the reason I brought this up is you could see that, there are these bigger structures that are doing things that are spitting off smaller structures.
Yeah, I see that sort of thing happening.
Did
Oh
you
yeah.
do anything in 2 dimensions?
Yeah. But this is sort of like, yeah, I see what you mean by like a one-dimensional kind of example of that. Yeah, that's cool. Let's see. What else do I have? Here's a more automated version. A lot of these rules were just picked out by hand of like, oh, this looks interesting. But this was supposed to be a more automated version of that. Um, though it's a little laggy, I have to say, because it has a lot of these random plots in it. Okay, yeah. So here's like totalistic k equals 3, r equals 1. And you get some interesting stuff there. I did it for k equals, here's more k equals 3, r equals 1. Here's k equals 2, r equals 3. Yeah, these are just crazy, all of them. But there's, it's a bit of, there are too many here to analyze or to get, anything particular, anything particular to say about them. They're all cool, but cool. Yeah, this is a crazy one.
Oh,
Here's a
that's
crazy,
interesting. It's kind of weaving back and forth.
yeah. And here's k equals 4, r equals 1.
Slow down,
Yeah,
hold on. Those were interesting.
I think here, yeah, here are the most interesting ones of these, maybe. Yeah, actually, yeah, these are more interesting.
There's another sort of brick pattern. It goes left and right, oscillates.
Yeah.
Although these are causally isolated from each other, it looks like.
Which ones?
These here.
Oh yeah, in that case they are causally isolated. This is so the picture on the left is like an example of what this rule tends to do. So it's just a random, and then the stuff is structures. So you can actually see that there are some that are like, brought together, but are, causally linked, even though it's multiple copies of this same 6 structure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There was like one code 88 thing that I found that was like a glider gun on both sides with a huge period, but I looked it up and it actually had been found before as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's somewhere in one of these rules. Yeah, here's some interesting Sierpinski things, including one that kind of does this sort of thing, where it's only Sierpinski on one side, but eventually I believe it collapses into Sierpinski like this. So it has this really long kind of build up, which is interesting. I think this is an example I used in the slideshow, actually. This is code 1329. It rediscovered it. Oh yeah, there's this one, which is crazy. This I used as an example of complex growth.
Mm-hmm.
Here's where I did some of the discovery rate stuff. There's actually a distinction between the like deduplicated plots and the when does any structure get generated. And I have those plots somewhere. Oh, I guess not here. That's probably in the newer file. Yeah, and then a bunch more other stuff. There's this thing, which is an interesting grower that's very, confined,
Mm-hmm.
etc. I did some, yeah, I took a look at like all totalistic rules from various rule sets. But most of the behavior was moderately boring. Not entirely boring, but not I didn't know what to do with it. Say.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, here it is. There's this guy, which is some already known thing, apparently. But it does have this interesting behavior where it shoots off stuff to one side, then to the other side.
Yeah, those look like gliders with like period 2 or something.
Yeah.
Or perhaps period 1. I don't know.
I think it might be period 1. It's hard to see over Zoom. Yeah, it's period 1. But yeah, in the center, it just goes back and forth and creates more of them. There's this crazy Sierpinski, which is, yeah, me too. And I'll put this one in chat as well, actually. This is fun. There's this, this is code 20, and this is the other rule. And it behaves the exact same, but just at a width of, but just like kind of spread out by 2. So each pair of inputs denotes a single input to code 20, which is, pretty funny to look at, but it behaves that way. And yeah, you can see all the same structures as in code 20, like here and here, but just spread out. And it also has some new structures like this and this. So that was something interesting I found. Is there anything interesting here?
It says it's interesting.
Yeah, one would hope so. It's not uninteresting. But it's not also particularly good. Yeah, I think that's most of the, pretty pictures that I generated.
Mm-hmm.
But
wait, did I see a Shannon something?
yeah, so that algorithm I came up with there's this thing called Shannon form of like a Boolean expression.
Uh-huh.
I wonder if it's Boolean expansion theorem. Yeah, Shannon expansion. Where you take, what is it? Oh yeah, so if you want to represent a Boolean function as a circuit, you can say the first variable and the top half, or the second variable, or not the first variable and the bottom half. And so that's kind of very similar to what I did. Because when I was figuring out this algorithm, I was like, has someone come up with, a similar type of thing before? And so I tried, looking it up. And this was, similar but different because in general it uses, there's one and, another and, an or, and a not. So that's 4 operations per division versus 2 operations for mine per division. So since I'm trying to minimize gate count, this is useful in studying functions and in generating them, I guess. But oh yeah, this is like equivalent to like kind of a tree of like, oh, look at the first variable. Is it in this state or this state? And then kind of go from there. But since I'm trying to solve a different problem, I ended up with something similar, but which minimized gate count rather than trying to be informative in that sort of way. So yeah, I called it Shannon XOR form is the name I used for it because it's sort of like this Shannon expansion except with XORs.
I
Oh,
wonder
and
if every rule can be decomposed into Boolean gates.
I haven't I see no reason why it couldn't be. I mean, that's what I did with the GPU solver. It's just, there's I mean, every single cellular automata rule is just a lookup table.
Right.
You if there are more colors than just 2, you can split them up into multiples, and then you can just kind of get that out. I wanted to show the anti-identity rule, so I'm going to show that. And then I might also show the that I Control F anti-identity rule. Oh yeah, here it is. So given any random integer, it tends to do this, and this is its rule plot. So it's just the exact opposite, except in this bottom right-hand corner. Yeah. And then if I run, do I need to run the initialization? Let me give it a second to run. Let me close out some of these. Okay, here.
Got 14 cores.
Yeah. I don't know why it's 14 cores. It's very weird that I had 14 cores, but whatever. Binning is weird. Okay, so yeah, for code 20, it came up with this update rule. Actually, I know that if I let it run for longer, I have a timeout for how long it takes to find these circuits. Because for very large circuits, it might take 10 seconds to find the really optimal circuit, but it's not even going to spend that much time running on the GPU. So it's better to just pick the first thing that comes out and use that, which is usually like a like Boolean minimize of a function. Like CNF. Like that's usually very fast to compute. But it takes a lot of gates. So there's sort of a balancing act that you need to do there. And if I do it for something like 1329, you'll see this code actually changes.
Oh, so it rewrote that kernel.cl.
I mean, hopefully you'll see the code changes. What is taking so long? Oh, I did bump it up to 10 seconds. Okay. Yeah, so here's what it does now. Is it comes up with this, moderately larger expression, but it still kind of does the same exact thing. And it also pre-computes a bunch of these, like, what's the number of colors? How many bits does that need? What's the radius? Is it symmetric or not? And if it's symmetric, you can, discard about half of your initial conditions, or not half, but you can discard some initial conditions if it's symmetric, etc. And so it just shifts all of the integers by different amounts. And that means that, at like position 0 in all of these different integers, you get the neighborhood around whatever you want. And then it just constructs an expression, which the GPU is able to just run. Like it just makes C code. And you can see the template is like, yeah, this is what's replaced with this function eventually. And I just have Wolfram code that, runs through, checks for these templates and replaces them. So for like a speed test, for example, we run code 20 up to 100 million. It does not take a terribly long time. Anything up to say even a billion will take a non-negligible amount of time, but it's pretty fast. And I don't even have a discrete GPU. This is all running on my CPU, my poor CPU. Yeah. So it chugs, but it can do it. And yeah, then we get all these structures, which are very cool. I can do.
So the CPU is chugging away to decompose these Boolean gates and then programmatically write .cl files that are then used for used in GPU to program the GPU.
Exactly. Actually, I have where is it? Yeah, so it generates the like Boolean function, and then that writes it to an OpenCL file, and then that OpenCL file is used by a C program to run it on the GPU, and it writes all that to an output file. So you can actually kind of see what it's doing by looking at how much of your CPU is being used. So here is when it computes all those Boolean gates, and it runs a bunch of different algorithms on different cores. Oh, let me try doing it this way. Oh no, I think it optimized. It's able to memoize a little bit. I think it did that. Not have run it for 30 billion. Whatever. Let it chug. But what you'll see here, if I run it again, so this is where we are at currently. It'll spend some amount of CPU, this little bump here, to try and do those Boolean expressions. And then it'll run the big search on the GPU. Oh.
Whoa. That's a lot.
It is too fast, apparently. It's too optimized. Darn it. Whatever. But the point is that it takes a little bit of CPU time to figure out all those, expressions, and it uses the GPU for the rest once it has it figured out. Yeah, and then we can
That's
do.
really cool.
Thanks.
Really clever too.
Yeah, so with stuff like 1329, a lot of the results just get too wide before they can stabilize.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll get some interesting glider guns like here and here, but you'll also get stuff that, would be caught by something like detect period. So if I run detect period on all of these and dedupe, I will get a smaller number. But that's, on the CPU and is slower. Like 100 microseconds doesn't sound like a lot. But if you need to do it a million times, then it adds up.
100 microseconds. So that's 0.1 milliseconds.
I believe so. Yeah. So it'd be like,
Yeah.
well, I do happen to know that 1329 is one of the slowest ones because it has so many glider guns, and glider guns sometimes take a really long time. But I can try to do a parallel map of detect period over what is it, %81.
Yeah. But yeah, part 2.
Yeah, and then if I join all of them and dedupe all of the same structures, then I'll get something like, let's see how long that takes. It might take, it'll either go very quick or very not quick. And my bet's on very not quick. That seems to be accurate. Yeah, because even though on average it gets really good time on stuff that takes a long time to stabilize and that gets very big very quickly while it's stabilizing, it's slow. So that's about the worst case scenario for it. But on something like, if I wanted to do a search over code 20, I could just do this. Oh, I didn't mean to delete it. Yeah, and that's fairly fast. I mean, nothing compared to the, hyper optimized, bit packed, GPU accelerated search. But if you want to search like a random section as well, this is better. Because the GPU can only search over a certain range from 0 to something. And in fact, on the GPU, one really good optimization is that, say you're starting at a number n, that's your initial condition. And if you're running a search for all numbers up to n, then if your update step ever happens to get your condition to be something smaller than n, then you can immediately stop because something's already checked that. So it's a really good kind of optimization to just do that right away. Why didn't that return anything? Oh, %88. Yeah, and so that's what you'll get out. And theoretically, this is going to be the exact same as what you get out from a GPU search. But yeah.
Awesome. A lot of spinning plates there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if genetic um, genetic algorithm search.
I did try a genetic algorithm. Or I know Willem actually tried a little bit more on that than I did. Because for example, the thing I showed here about like how it's so sensitive to initial condition,
Uh-huh.
it's very hard to do that kind of thing on a genetic algorithm because there's very little correlation between small changes in your input and small changes in your output.
Right.
That's why I tried the like continuous thing. Where is it? B. Oh yeah, genetic code 20. I'm gonna guess V6 will give me something. Yeah, so you can like interpolate. This is code 20, and you can interpolate it over, the reals, and you can try to optimize it. So this is, you're optimizing for, I want to have the maximum value right here, 100 steps down the line.
Mm-hmm.
And it is able to do that, but just not in a way that you can actually turn into anything useful.
Wait, so
What on earth is this? Yeah, so if you
what color space is this?
this isn't a this is the real numbers are its color space.
Okay, so this is continuous.
Yeah, so I just interpolate between this is horrible code meant to make it as performant as possible.
Uh-huh.
But the net effect of this is since this is a totalistic rule, um, you can interpolate between the sums. So say like, if the sum is 0, then it goes to 0. If the sum is 1, then it goes to 0. If the sum is 2, then it goes to 1. If the sum is 3, then it goes to 0. If the sum is 4, it goes to 1. And otherwise, it goes to 0. So what you can do is just have a graph that goes, sort of like 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0. And that'll be your function. So this is f, the sum of your neighborhood. And I think I do an activation function in here somewhere. So, it could be any interpolation of this is valid. Just as long as it's the same points as the actual rule. So what the rule says is here it needs to be this, 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 etc. And as long as you can play between that, then you get a valid function.
Right.
So
So that's interesting because
yeah, like here's the interpolation on a big input. Oh my goodness, this is having trouble. There must be a very big plot that's about to come. Oh, even worse.
are these still the continuous cases?
Yeah. So I think this is a continuously like varying. Oh yeah, this is the optimization thing. Oh, I know what this is. This is interesting actually. So if you run it and have it like circle back on itself, um, it does that. But that's, who knows what that means. Yeah, so the ultimate goal was to say like, now that we have this, continuous version of it, what you want to do is say, way down the line, down here, I want you to maximize the value that will be down here. Like I want this to be a 1. I want there to be a 1 down here. And ideally, what you would hope for to happen is that it'll go through all these continuous cases and eventually descend into a completely binary case where you can give it an input and it'll give you a binary, 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 binary. But that doesn't always happen. You have to tweak the activation function a lot for that to happen. You'll get
I'm let's see. I'm sending you a file. I looked at some continuous CAs last year,
Yep.
and found some like really interesting replicants,
Let me stop.
replicators. So it's sending on Discord. It's still uploading.
Okay.
I can share screen. Hold on.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I think.
All right. This is working. This is working. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, what's happening is I'm sort of there's a activation function that's linear. It's got a cutoff, and then you could sort of change the parameters. I find that
Oh, interesting.
mm-hmm. Lower values of the slope here are more stable, and see a lot of repeated structures. Some
So is this like
structures,
the sum of your nearest neighbors and apply this activation?
right, right, and this is radius 1. Um, anyway, so I went through some examples and I found interesting cases. Here's the slope and offset values, and so for this one, you have gliders popping out left and right. They seem to be repeating. Um, oh, and then
Oh,
here
wow.
sort of some growing bits.
Do you
Um,
get any interesting cases where there like isn't the this discontinuity in the activation function?
um,
I guess I wouldn't expect there to be, right? Because it would. That's just that's just a. You wouldn't. Never mind, because that would just be a linear function,
yeah.
and that's just.
Well, so yeah, it's typically you have this banding structure, and uh, you sort of take the difference of like
Oh,
you
yeah.
you have to take differences along the rows in order to extract out what we're looking at. But yeah, the interesting stuff happens when you do have a discontinuity in the activation function.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Because if you didn't, that would just be, compositions of linear functions are linear.
Mm-hmm. And also, what's interesting is you'll have stuff that looks like it's repeating, but like it's so subtle the way it's
Hmm.
like the real numbers are changing up, um, such that it'll work its way up to a critical point and then start evolving.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I really like
You,
this one.
you can imagine trying to like set up constraints where it's like, oh, try and make the top as similar to the bottom as you can,
Mm-hmm.
and then use and minimize or gradient descent or some optimization techniques to try and enforce that. And you could get interesting structures that are periodic, um but that are
Yeah,
continuous.
here's an interesting one where it's like
Oh yeah, almost
a little
exact copy.
almost makes an exact copy of itself and then stops doing anything after that. I believe
Yeah.
I don't think it does anything interesting, but yeah. And here's another example.
Oh yeah.
That's a rocket ship. Yeah, so yeah, there's a lot going on with continuous CAs and um, various replicators. And verifying this with exact arithmetic is something that we need to do. It needs to be
That
done.
yeah, that seems hard, but I mean it's slow potentially,
It's
but
super slow. Yeah,
yeah,
can't put that on a GPU.
nope. No. Be hard.
The use like rational numbers, and the denominators get like every just the thousands of
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's
fractions
true.
that are like thousands long by the end of it.
Yeah. So that would not be possible at all.
Yeah, when every number is like a kilobyte. you know. But yeah, so really fun, and need to get back to that project.
Yeah. All right. Are there any more questions?
Um, I think we'll close down stream, and yeah, thank you once again for coming on and showing your work.
Yeah,
All
thank
this
you
cool
so much.
stuff. Thanks for everyone tuning in on live stream, and
All
we'll
right.
see you again next time.
Thank you.